The morning sun cast long shadows across the bustling streets of downtown Seattle, where the aroma of fresh coffee and warm pastries drifted through the air. Outside the trendy Blue Corner Cafe, a man in his mid-30s adjusted his Italian silk tie and stretched his legs out further, deliberately taking up more space on the pristine sidewalk. This was Mr. Chen's favorite spot to spend his mornings, showing off his wealth to anyone who passed by. Today, he had strategically surrounded himself with shopping bags from luxury stores, Gucci, Louis Vuitton, and Prada, each one positioned so their logos faced outward. His solid gold watch caught the sunlight as he raised his $9 artisanal coffee to his lips, making sure everyone could see the flash of his diamond cufflinks. The other regulars at the cafe knew him well. The baristas always had his complex order ready, an extra hot, triple-shot oat milk latte with sugar-free caramel and a hint of vanilla. He made sure to tip generously, but only when others were watching. Mr. Chen wasn't just wealthy, he wanted everyone to know it. His peaceful morning ritual was interrupted when he noticed someone new in his carefully curated space. An older man in worn clothes had settled onto a nearby bench, clutching a weathered backpack to his chest. The stranger's presence seemed to create a ripple effect. Other patrons subtly shifted away, parents guided their children to the other side of the street, and the cafe's staff exchanged worried glances. Mr. Chen felt his jaw tighten. This was his territory, his carefully selected piece of premium real estate where he came to be seen by the right people. He watched as the man quietly pulled out a notebook that had definitely seen better days, its pages wrinkled and dog-eared. The stranger seemed oblivious to the stares and whispers around him as he began writing with intense focus. "This is getting ridiculous," Mr. Chen muttered loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. He pulled out his phone, its diamond-encrusted case glinting in the sun, and began making a show of typing furiously. Property values are going to drop if they let just anyone hang around here. A group of young professionals in smart suits nodded in agreement as they hurried past, clutching their own expensive coffee cups. Mr. Chen felt a surge of satisfaction at their approval. He'd worked hard to build his image in this neighborhood, and he wasn't about to let it be tarnished. The stranger looked up briefly from his writing, his eyes meeting Mr. Chen's for just a moment. There was something in that calm gaze that made Mr. Chen uncomfortable, not fear or shame, but something he couldn't quite read. The man's eyes held a depth of knowledge that seemed out of place with his appearance, but Mr. Chen quickly dismissed the thought. Instead, he focused on making his displeasure known. He shifted his shopping bags to create an even wider barrier between himself and the bench, nearly blocking the sidewalk in the process. When other cafe patrons had to step into the street to get around his expensive obstacle course, he pretended not to notice. A sleek Tesla pulled up to the curb, and Mr. Chen made sure to wave enthusiastically at its driver. Another regular from his exclusive gym. "We should grab lunch at that new place," he called out loudly. "You know, the one with the 3-month waiting list?" He emphasized the last part, glancing pointedly at the man on the bench. The stranger simply continued writing in his notebook, his pen moving steadily across the page. His calm demeanor only served to irritate Mr. Chen further. People like that were supposed to move along when made unwelcome. That's how things worked in his world. As the morning wore on, Mr. Chen's coffee grew cold, forgotten in his increasing preoccupation with the unwanted visitor. He couldn't focus on his usual routine of checking stock prices and making impressive-sounding phone calls. The man's presence felt like a smudge on an otherwise perfect painting, and Mr. Chen was already planning how to ensure this disruption wouldn't become a regular occurrence. Little did he know, his perfectly curated world was about to be turned upside down, and the quiet man with the notebook would be the catalyst for a change he never saw coming. Over the next week, the Blue Corner Cafe became a battlefield of subtle warfare. Mr. Chen arrived earlier each morning, determined to claim his territory and make life uncomfortable for the mysterious stranger who dared to disturb his perfect world. The man with the notebook never failed to appear, always choosing the same bench, always writing with the same focused concentration. Monday started with Mr. Chen's first tactical move. He arranged for the cafe's workers to spray down the sidewalks just before the stranger usually arrived, ensuring the bench would be soaking wet. But the quiet man simply pulled out a small towel from his worn backpack, dried off his spot, and continued his writing as if nothing had happened. By Tuesday, Mr. Chen had escalated his campaign. He hired 2 personal trainers from his expensive gym to occupy the bench with an elaborate stretching routine. They took up the entire space, grunting and sweating through their exercises. The stranger simply moved to a nearby planter, perching on its edge with the same peaceful expression, his pen never stopping its journey across the pages. Wednesday brought a new strategy. Mr. Chen called his friend who worked for the city planning office, complaining about suspicious activity in the area. A police officer showed up to check the situation, but after a brief conversation with the man, the officer simply nodded respectfully and moved on. Mr. Chen couldn't believe his eyes when the officer even seemed to smile as he left. Thursday's attempt involved music. Mr. Chen brought a portable speaker, playing his business calls on speakerphone at maximum volume. The cacophony of stock quotes and investment jargon bounced off the buildings, driving other patrons away. Yet the mysterious man appeared unbothered, occasionally glancing up from his notebook with what almost looked like amusement in his eyes. By Friday, other regulars had started to notice Mr. Chen's behavior. He overheard whispers questioning why he was so obsessed with bothering someone who was simply minding their own business. But their disapproval only fueled his determination. He spent his morning loudly discussing property values with anyone who would listen, pointing out how certain elements were bringing down the neighborhood's reputation. The weekend brought no relief to Mr. Chen's growing frustration. He usually avoided the cafe on Saturdays and Sundays, considering them too common for his tastes. But he made an exception, driving past multiple times to check if the stranger was there. He was, rain or shine, writing in that same mysterious notebook. The following Monday, Mr. Chen decided to involve the local business association. He attended their morning meeting, dressed in his finest suit, and made an impassioned speech about maintaining the area's exclusive atmosphere. Several owners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others seemed more interested in the stranger's notebook than Mr. Chen's complaints. What puzzled Mr. Chen most was the man's apparent immunity to shame. Every dirty look, every loud comment about cleaning up the streets, every orchestrated attempt to make him leave, none of it seemed to penetrate the bubble of calm that surrounded him. The stranger's pen moved steadily across the pages, filling notebook after notebook with whatever thoughts occupied his mind. Some of the cafe's staff had even started to warm up to the quiet visitor. Mr. Chen watched in disbelief as one barista brought out a cup of hot tea, setting it beside the man during a particularly cold morning. The stranger's thank you was so genuine, so warm, that even Mr. Chen felt a tiny crack appear in his wall of prejudice, though he quickly patched it up. The notebooks themselves became an obsession for Mr. Chen. What could someone like that possibly be writing? Shopping lists? Conspiracy theories? The question consumed his thoughts, distracting him from his usual routine of showing off his wealth and maintaining his image. Little did Mr. Chen know, those weathered pages contained observations that would soon turn his carefully constructed world upside down. Each dirty look, each cruel comment, each attempted eviction, all were being recorded with a purpose far beyond his imagination. The quiet man's pen wasn't just writing words, it was documenting a story of prejudice and privilege that was about to reach its turning point. The morning started differently than the others. A bitter winter wind whipped through downtown Seattle's streets, sending scattered leaves dancing across the sidewalk. Mr. Chen arrived at the Blue Corner Cafe, wrapped in a designer wool coat that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Today, he had decided, would be the day he finally got rid of his unwanted neighbor. His morning coffee tasted bitter despite its expensive blend and precise preparation. For 2 weeks now, he'd watched the mysterious man with the notebook chip away at his perfect world just by existing in it. Even worse, some of his business associates had started avoiding their usual morning meetings at the cafe, making excuses about trying other locations. The final straw came when he overheard 2 young entrepreneurs, exactly the kind of people he wanted to impress, talking about him. That guy with all the shopping bags, one had whispered to the other, "Don't waste your time pitching to him. I heard he spends more time harassing homeless people than actually doing business." Mr. Chen's face had burned with embarrassment and anger. He'd built his reputation carefully over the years, curating every detail of his public image. Now it was being destroyed by someone who probably didn't even own a proper pair of shoes. He pulled out his phone and made the call he'd been saving for a moment like this. 20 minutes later, 2 security guards from the building's management company arrived. They were both tall, broad-shouldered men in crisp uniforms, carefully selected by Mr. Chen for their intimidating presence. He'd spent the last week cultivating a relationship with the building's security team, dropping hints about generous holiday bonuses for those who helped maintain the area's standards. The stranger was in his usual spot, seemingly unaffected by the cold wind that ruffled the pages of his notebook. Today, though, something was different about his writing. His pen moved more slowly, more deliberately, as if he was choosing each word with extra care. Mr. Chen straightened his tie and checked his reflection in the cafe window. He wanted to look his best for what he was about to do. Other morning regulars had started to gather, sensing the tension in the air. Some pulled out their phones, ready to record whatever was about to happen. "Excuse me," Mr. Chen said loudly, stepping forward with the security guards flanking him. He made sure his gold watch was clearly visible as he gestured dramatically. "I believe you're loitering on private property. These gentlemen will escort you to a more appropriate location." The stranger didn't immediately look up from his notebook. His pen continued its steady journey across the page, completing what looked like a final sentence. The silence stretched out, making Mr. Chen increasingly uncomfortable. "Did you get me?" Mr. Chen's voice rose, carrying across the now quiet street. "I said you need to leave. People like me built this neighborhood. We work hard for what we have. We don't just sit around all day writing in notebooks and bringing down property values." The other cafe patrons had gone completely still. Even the baristas pressed against the windows, watching the scene unfold. The winter wind seemed to hold its breath. Finally, the mysterious man closed his notebook. He looked up, meeting Mr. Chen's gaze with the same calm expression he'd worn every day. But now there was something else in his eyes, a quiet intensity that made the security guards shift uncomfortably. "I've been wondering," the stranger said, his voice surprisingly clear and well-spoken, "if you would ever work up the courage to speak to me directly." He tucked his pen into the notebook's spiral binding with deliberate care. "You've spent 2 weeks talking about me to everyone else. Now that you're finally talking to me, I have just one question." Mr. Chen felt a strange uneasiness creep up his spine. The man's dignified tone didn't match his worn appearance. The security guards glanced at each other, their earlier confidence wavering. "What kind of people exactly," the stranger continued, "do you think built this neighborhood? And what kind of people do you think are ruining it?" He held Mr. Chen's gaze steadily. "I'm very interested in your answer. In fact, I've been documenting answers to that question for quite some time now." The crowd that had gathered held its collective breath. Mr. Chen opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time in his life, he found himself completely speechless. Something about the stranger's quiet confidence made his carefully planned confrontation feel suddenly terribly wrong. He had no idea that in just a few moments, his entire world was about to change forever. The tension in the air could have been cut with a knife. Mr. Chen stood frozen, his expensive shoes planted on the sidewalk, as the stranger's question hung in the cold morning air. The security guards looked increasingly uncertain, shifting their weight from foot to foot as they waited for someone to break the uncomfortable silence. Then came the sound that would change everything, the smooth purr of a luxury car engine. A midnight black Rolls-Royce Phantom rolled silently to the curb, its darkened windows reflecting the morning sun. The car alone probably cost more than every vehicle on the block combined. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the rear door opened with practiced precision. A woman stepped out, her tailored suit speaking of old money and quiet power. Her heels clicked purposefully against the pavement as she approached the bench. The security guards automatically stepped aside, their training kicking in at the sight of someone who clearly commanded authority. "Mr. Wilson," she said, addressing the man on the bench with clear respect in her voice. "The board meeting begins in an hour. I have the final documents for your review." She held a leather portfolio that probably cost more than Mr. Chen's entire designer outfit. The stranger, Mr. Wilson, smiled warmly at her. "Thank you, Mrs. Lee. Perfect timing as always." He reached into his worn backpack and pulled out what looked like an ordinary pen. Except it wasn't ordinary at all. Mr. Chen's eyes widened as he recognized the distinctive platinum and diamond pattern of a limited edition Mont Blanc worth over $50,000. Only 100 were ever made. Mr. Wilson began reviewing the documents, his practiced eye scanning each page with the efficiency of someone who regularly dealt with complex business matters. The crowd watched in fascination as he occasionally made notes in the margins with his luxury pen, each mark precise and confident. Mrs. Lee turned to address the security guards. "I trust everything is in order here." Her tone made it clear that any other answer besides yes would be unacceptable. The guards quickly stepped back, mumbling apologies as they retreated toward the building. Mr. Chen felt his carefully constructed world tilting on its axis. His mind raced to make sense of what he was seeing. The homeless man he'd been trying to drive away was casually reviewing what looked like major business documents, using a pen worth more than most cars, while a Rolls-Royce waited for him at the curb. "Just a few final signatures," Mr. Wilson said, his voice carrying the same calm it had shown during 2 weeks of harassment. "Though I must say, these past weeks have been quite enlightening." He looked up at Mr. Chen, who had gone pale. "Would you like to know what I've been writing in these notebooks?" Without waiting for an answer, he opened his weathered notebook. Inside were detailed observations, expertly documented incidents of discrimination, and careful notes about community dynamics. Each page was filled with the kind of insight that could only come from someone who deeply understood both business and human nature. "This intersection," Mr. Wilson continued, gesturing to the surrounding buildings, "has been the focus of a 6-month study by my foundation. We've been researching how wealthy areas treat their less fortunate neighbors. Your behavior, Mr. Chen, has been particularly interesting to document." A youngington from the cafe, who had been watching everything unfold, dropped an empty paper cup. The sound echoed in the stunned silence. Mr. Wilson smiled at her kindly before turning back to the documents. "Mrs. Lee," he said, signing the final page with a flourish, "please make sure our real estate division processes these right away. As of this morning, we own not just this building, but the entire block." He looked up at Mr. Chen. "Including, I believe, the office space where your investment firm is currently leasing." The crowd's whispers grew louder. Phone cameras captured everything as the man who had been dismissed as homeless was revealed to be something entirely different. Mr. Wilson carefully placed his notebook in his worn backpack, a bag that, despite its appearance, had probably been chosen specifically for this social experiment. Standing up, Mr. Wilson straightened to his full height. His posture changed subtly, and suddenly everyone could see it. The confident bearing of someone who commanded boardrooms, the quiet authority that came not just from wealth, but from using that wealth purposefully. "Your coffee's getting cold, Mr. Chen," he said softly, nodding toward the forgotten cup on the cafe table. "Though I suppose we should discuss your company's lease renewal over a fresh one. That is, if you're still comfortable sharing space with people like me." The morning sun continued to rise over downtown Seattle, illuminating a scene that would be talked about for years to come. And Mr. Chen, standing there in his expensive coat and designer shoes, finally understood that he had been judging books by their covers and had badly misread this one. The next few minutes unfolded like a dream, or in Mr. Chen's case, a very public nightmare. The morning crowd outside Blue Corner Cafe had grown, with people instinctively forming a circle around the scene. Phones remained raised, recording every moment of this extraordinary revelation. Mr. Wilson stood calmly, his worn backpack slung over one shoulder. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private," he suggested, gesturing toward his waiting Rolls-Royce. His voice carried no hint of triumph or mockery, just the same quiet dignity he'd shown throughout the past 2 weeks. As they walked to the car, whispers rippled through the crowd. Someone from the local business paper had arrived, already typing frantically on their phone. Mr. Chen felt like he was walking through molasses, each step heavy with the weight of his very public humiliation. Inside the car, the leather seats were butter soft and the interior was climate-controlled to perfection. It was a stark contrast to the cold bench where Mr. Wilson had spent his mornings. Mrs. Lee sat across from them, efficiently organizing documents as Mr. Wilson began to speak. "Let me properly introduce myself," he said, his calm voice filling the quiet space. "I'm the founder of the Wilson Foundation for Urban Development and Social Change. We have a rather unique approach to understanding city dynamics. He gestured to his worn clothes with a slight smile. As you've discovered, we believe in gathering first-hand experience. The car glided smoothly through downtown traffic as Mr. Wilson continued. Over the past year, I've conducted similar experiments in 12 major cities. Seattle is our latest study area. He pulled out his notebook, its pages now carrying a different kind of weight. We've found that the best way to understand how a community treats its most vulnerable members is to become one of them. Mr. Chen stared at his own reflection in the car's tinted windows. His designer suit and carefully styled hair suddenly seemed like a costume, a mask he'd been hiding behind. The Foundation's work, Mr. Wilson explained, goes far beyond just observing. We're actively working to create change. Opening his leather portfolio, Mr. Wilson spread out several documents. They detailed plans for community development, homeless support programs, and business initiatives that made Mr. Chen's head spin. The numbers involved were staggering. Billions of dollars in investments, all carefully planned and researched. Your building wasn't the only property we acquired, Mr. Wilson continued. We now own significant portions of downtown Seattle. But ownership isn't our goal, transformation is. He pulled out a USB drive that had been tucked into his notebook. This contains video evidence of discrimination from all 12 cities. Your actions these past 2 weeks, they're just a small part of a much larger story. Mr. Chen felt his throat go dry as he watched Mrs. Lee plug the drive into a laptop, bringing up clips of his own behavior. There he was, making loud comments about cleaning up the streets, calling security, trying to have someone removed simply because they didn't fit his image of who belonged in his world. But here's what you might find interesting, Mr. Wilson said, turning the laptop screen. These clips also show something else. He played a different video, showing small acts of kindness that had occurred during his experiment. The young barista who brought him tea. An elderly woman who shared her umbrella during a rain shower. A child who offered him half of her muffin, despite her mother's initial hesitation. You see, Mr. Chen, our foundation isn't just documenting problems, we're identifying opportunities for change. And sometimes, he paused, looking directly at Mr. Chen, the people who seem most resistant to change become our most valuable partners in creating it. The car slowed to a stop outside a towering office building. Through the window, Mr. Chen could see camera crews already gathering. Word had spread fast. Mr. Wilson seemed unfazed by the media attention, calmly gathering his documents. You have a choice to make, he said simply. You can walk out that door and try to spin this story your way. Or, he held up another document, you can join us in making real change in this community. Your experience in property development could be valuable if you're willing to look at it from a different perspective. Mr. Chen looked down at his expensive shoes, remembering how proudly he'd worn them while trying to make another human being feel worthless. When he looked up again, his eyes held something new, understanding and perhaps a glimmer of hope. The choice he would make in the next few moments would not only change his life, but would ripple through the community in ways he couldn't yet imagine. As the morning sun climbed higher over Seattle, illuminating both the gleaming skyscrapers and the shadowed streets below, a new chapter was about to begin. The afternoon sun found Mr. Chen sitting in a conference room 50 stories above Seattle, his world turned upside down. The view through the floor-to-ceiling windows showed both sides of the city he thought he knew, the gleaming towers and the struggling streets below. Mr. Wilson's presentation had been running for 2 hours, but not a single person in the room had checked their phone or dozed off. Our research shows something fascinating, Mr. Wilson explained, clicking to the next slide. The screen filled with data from his 2-week experiment. Every single person who treated me poorly while I was on that bench had something in common, and it wasn't wealth. He paused, letting his words sink in. It was fear. Mr. Chen shifted uncomfortably in his chair as security footage played on the screen. There he was, day after day, trying to chase away someone he saw as a threat to his carefully built world. The footage then split to show similar scenes from other cities, other well-dressed people going out of their way to make others feel unwelcome. But here's where it gets interesting, Mr. Wilson continued, his voice warm with enthusiasm. When we offered these same people a chance to be part of the solution, 83% of them took it. He clicked to another slide showing transformed communities, renovated buildings with mixed-income housing, and thriving local businesses. The door opened quietly as Mrs. Lee entered with a stack of folders. "These are the preliminary plans for the Blue Corner district," she announced, distributing them around the table. Mr. Chen opened his folder and felt his breath catch. The plans showed a completely reimagined neighborhood, but not in the way he'd expected. Instead of pushing people out, the designs showed ways to bring people together. The cafe would expand to include a job training center. The empty building next door would become affordable housing with a rooftop garden. The wide sidewalk where Mr. Wilson had sat would transform into a community plaza with chess tables and public art. "Mr. Chen," Mr. Wilson said, drawing everyone's attention, "you know real estate better than most people in this room. What do you see in these plans?" Standing up slowly, Mr. Chen approached the large blueprint spread across the table. His trained eye noticed details others might miss: the careful space planning, the potential for sustainable revenue, the smart integration of various social services. But he also saw something else, something he'd been blind to before. "I see opportunity," he said finally, his voice thoughtful. "Not just for profit, but for actual change." He pointed to several areas on the blueprint. "These spaces, they're designed to bring different types of people together, aren't they? To break down the barriers we put up." Mr. Wilson smiled, nodding appreciatively. "Exactly. And that's where you come in." He walked over to the windows, gesturing at the city below. "You spent years learning how to make spaces exclusive. Now, what if you use that same knowledge to make them inclusive instead?" The room buzzed with energy as Mr. Chen began pointing out more details in the plans. His expertise in property development, originally used to keep people out, was now highlighting ways to welcome people in. Other board members leaned forward, taking notes as he spoke about traffic patterns, retail psychology, and community engagement. The coffee shop manager, Mr. Chen, said suddenly, remembering something. "The one who brought you tea that cold morning, she had ideas about community programs, didn't she?" He'd overheard her talking about it once, though he dismissed it at the time. Mr. Wilson's eyes lit up. "She did. In fact, she's joining our planning committee next week. Her insight from working directly with the community is invaluable." He turned to address the whole room. "This is how real change happens, when we start seeing the potential in people we once ignored." The afternoon wore on, but the energy never flagged. Mr. Chen found himself deeply engaged in discussions about microloans for small businesses, mentorship programs for at-risk youth, and innovative housing solutions. His mind, once focused solely on exclusivity and status, was now racing with ideas for inclusion and growth. "One last thing," Mr. Wilson said as the meeting drew to a close. He pulled out his worn notebook, the same one that had captured Mr. Chen's downfall. "Would you like to know what I wrote about you that first morning?" The room grew quiet. Mr. Chen hesitated, then nodded. Mr. Wilson opened the notebook and read, "Subject appears to be protecting something deeper than his wealth, perhaps a sense of security he fears losing. Potential for transformation if shown a new way to feel secure through helping others rather than excluding them." Mr. Chen felt the truth of those words hit home. All his displays of wealth, all his efforts to push others away, they had been armor against his own fears. Now, looking at the plans spread across the table, he saw a different kind of security taking shape. As the sun began to set over Seattle, casting long shadows through the conference room windows, Mr. Chen realized he was no longer the same person who had walked into the building that morning. The lesson hadn't just been about wealth or status. It had been about seeing the true value in every human being, including himself. 1 year later, the morning sun rose over a very different street corner in downtown Seattle. The Blue Corner Cafe had doubled in size, with a new sign reading Blue Corner Community Hub hanging proudly above its doors. The bench where Mr. Wilson had sat was now part of a small plaza, complete with chess tables where people from all walks of life gathered to play. Mr. Chen walked down the street carrying 2 coffee cups. He was still wearing a suit, but something about him had changed. His walk was different, less about being seen and more about seeing others. He stopped at one of the chess tables where an elderly man was teaching a young student the game's basics. "Your usual morning coffee, Mr. P," he said, setting down one of the cups. The elderly man, once homeless himself, was now one of the cafe's most popular chess instructors. The student, a young girl from the new affordable housing complex, beamed as she moved her knight across the board. Inside the cafe, the transformation was even more striking. The space had been redesigned to include a training center where people could learn barista skills, basic accounting, and small business management. The walls, once covered in generic art prints, now displayed photographs of community success stories. The young barista who had once brought Mr. Wilson tea was now the program director. She moved confidently through the space, mentoring new trainees and greeting regular customers. Under her leadership, the training program had already helped 50 people secure stable jobs throughout the city. "The morning rush will be starting soon," she said, checking the schedule posted on a colorful board. Names of trainees were written in bright chalk, each one representing a story of opportunity and change. "Are you ready for your teaching session, Mr. Chen?" He nodded, setting down his own coffee. Twice a week, he taught classes on financial literacy and business planning. His students came from all backgrounds, some wearing business suits, others wearing clothes from the donation center next door. In his class, everyone was simply there to learn. The front door chimed as Mrs. Lee entered, carrying the latest impact report. The numbers were impressive. Homelessness in the area had decreased by 30%, small business ownership had increased by 45%, and community engagement was at an all-time high. But the real success stories weren't in the statistics, they were in the faces of people whose lives had changed. "Mr. Wilson is arriving this afternoon," she announced, a small smile playing at her lips. "He's finished his experiment in Chicago and wants to see how we're doing." The news spread quickly through the cafe, creating a buzz of excitement. Many of the current trainees had never met the man whose social experiment had transformed their neighborhood. Mr. Chen remembered his own transformation with crystal clarity. After that first revealing day, he'd thrown himself into the work of community development. His knowledge of real estate had proven invaluable in creating spaces that brought people together instead of keeping them apart. His old business contacts, initially skeptical, had become enthusiastic supporters once they saw the positive impact on the community. The morning crowd began filtering in, a mix of business people, students, local residents, and tourists who'd heard about the unique community hub. The cafe had become famous not for its expensive coffee, but for its innovative approach to social change. News organizations regularly visited to document its success. Near the counter, a wall of photographs told the story of the transformation. In the center was a picture from that fateful morning, Mr. Wilson sitting on his bench, writing in his notebook, while Mr. Chen stood nearby with his shopping bags. It served as a reminder of how quick judgments and prejudice could blind people to the humanity in others. As the morning progressed, Mr. Chen prepared for his class. Today's lesson was about investment, but not the kind he used to teach. Instead of focusing solely on financial returns, he taught his students about investing in people and communities. He'd learned that the greatest returns often came in forms that couldn't be measured in dollars. Around noon, a familiar black Rolls-Royce pulled up outside. Mr. Wilson stepped out, still carrying his worn backpack, now a symbol of the importance of looking beyond appearances. He paused to admire the transformed street, noting how the once exclusive space had become a vibrant community gathering place. "Quite a change from last year," Mr. Wilson said as he entered the cafe, smiling warmly at Mr. Chen. The two men, once on opposite sides of a social divide, now stood together as partners in positive change. "Though I have to ask, do you miss your designer shopping bags?" Mr. Chen laughed, a genuine sound that would have surprised his old self. "The only bags I carry now are full of teaching materials and community project plans." He gestured to his briefcase, stuffed with student proposals and program ideas. "It turns out those are much more satisfying." As they walked through the bustling cafe, Mr. Wilson noticed his old bench through the window. A young couple sat there now, sharing coffee with a person who appeared to be homeless. There was no judgment, no discomfort, just three humans sharing a moment in the morning sun. "The experiment continues," Mr. Wilson said softly, "but now you're the researcher." He pointed to a notebook on Mr. Chen's desk, not worn and weathered like his had been, but filled with equally important observations about community, change, and the power of seeing people for who they really are. The afternoon light streamed through the cafe's windows, illuminating a space where barriers had been broken and new connections forged. Mr. Chen looked around at what they'd built, not just a building or a business, but a bridge between different worlds. and he knew that somewhere in the city, Mr. Wilson was probably already planning his next experiment, helping another community learn the same valuable lesson about judging books by their covers.